The Fourth Way by P D Ouspensky, Chapter 16. I constantly get questions referring to recurrence, so I want to say something about it which may give you material for thinking. There are two reasons why I avoid speaking about it. First, we can only talk about the theory. We have no real facts about it. And secondly, we do not know whether in connection with the work the law is referring to, recurrence change. It is necessary to understand these things. We know very little about recurrence. Some day we may try to recollect what can be taken as reliable in all that is written about recurrence, and see which way we can think about it, but it is only a theory. I wrote in A New Model of the Universe long ago that even in ordinary life people may be very different in relation to recurrence. Some people may have exactly the same recurrence. Other people may have a different variation or possibility. Some may go up and others may go down, and many other things. But this is all without relation to the work. In the case of people who come nearer to the work, it may be possible, though only theoretically, to study 3 successive recurrences. Let us suppose that the first is when one comes close to the possibility of meeting with some kind of ideas of higher mind. The second, when one definitely comes in contact with C influence, and the third, which would be the result of it. The interesting thing is that after the second, the possibilities of recurrence greatly diminish. Before one comes into contact with C influence, they look unlimited, but after this contact the possibility of recurrence is reduced. If we understand that, we will be able to speak about recurrence with a certain amount of reason and profit. Otherwise, if we take everything on the same plane, it will be just theoretical talk and quite useless. Question. Do you mean that after coming in contact with C influences, the number of chances diminishes? Answer. Yes, because C influence cannot be wasted. B influences are practically unlimited. This means they are thrown into life and one can take or not take them. They do not diminish. But C influence is limited. Try to answer this question for yourselves and you will understand why the possibility of receiving C influence must be limited, because if one does not make use of it, what is the good of wasting it? Question. Does it mean if we worked in the right way our chances would increase? Answer. No, it does not mean that at all. It merely means that if we do not work in the right way, we will lose the possibility of these chances recurring. Without this additional feature I have just mentioned, it is quite useless to speak about recurrence even as a theory. In thinking about recurrence, it is useful to think about what is possible and what is impossible, what can happen and what cannot happen. Generally, people either do not accept this idea, or do not know about it, or do not understand it, or else accept too much, put too much into it. So it is useful to think in what relation we stand to it, and for this we must have a basis from which to start. For instance, it refers to remembering. People often ask about remembering past lives, but they forget that without the work of higher centres they cannot. Very often you hear people say, chiefly in connection with what they call reincarnation, that they can remember their lives in previous reincarnations, and they write books about what they were before. This is pure fantasy. You must understand that in our ordinary state we cannot remember past lives. There is nothing to remember with. In our mind and centres it is all new. What may pass from one life to another is its essence, so one can have only such vague sensations instead of definite recollections that it is hard to suppose that anyone can remember anything concrete. Only in the first years of life is it really possible, but then one generally does not notice this feeling, or if one does, it creates imagination. Question. What is the difference between the theory of reincarnation and the theory of recurrence? Answer. The idea of reincarnation is a kind of adaptation of the idea of recurrence to our ordinary understanding, because as a theory, the idea of recurrence is much more difficult for us. It needs quite a new understanding of time. Even educated people need a certain amount of mathematical knowledge to understand the idea of return. Recurrence is in eternity, but reincarnation is in time. It supposes that time exists apart from us, and that we continue to exist in this time after death. For instance, in Buddhism, they take it that a man dies and is immediately born again, so that one life follows another, because this is easier to understand for ordinary people. But we have no evidence of the existence of time beyond our life. Time is life for each person, and it includes in itself all time, so that when life ends, time ends. So reincarnation is a less scientific theory than recurrence. Too much is taken for granted. Question: but where do all these lives take place? Answer: we do not speak about the place, but about recurrence. If you say that you remembered that you lived in Rome, for instance, how can you find proof? It is impossible. So each theory can exist on different planes. The theory of recurrence can exist on a certain plane which requires a certain knowledge and a certain understanding, and then it can be distorted and brought down to lower and lower planes. This can happen with every theory, and sometimes in the process it can even become its own opposite. But you must always remember that we cannot prove anything and cannot insist on any particular theory. Only we must understand each theory within its own limits and its own cycle, and see what is possible and what is impossible from the point of view of this theory. If you take a theory and proceed to add one thing and to take away another, that would be wrong. In each theory one must study what it includes, and nothing must be omitted. So if we find a theory that is philosophically possible, we can look for conditions in which it would cease to be a theory and would become a fact. Question: am I wrong in assuming that you yourself are not convinced in the reality of the theory of eternal recurrence? Answer: I try to explain that you cannot be convinced of these ideas. If you think you can be conceived, it will be just belief. There are a whole series of questions and problems about which all we can do is to form theories without ever being really convinced that one theory is better than another. As a theory, I would say that the theory of recurrence is better than the theory of reincarnation, but we have no real evidence as to whether it is nearer to facts or not. And we cannot have evidence because of our state of consciousness. The only possibility from the point of view of work is to hope that perhaps, if we change our state of consciousness, our possibilities of observation will increase. In our present state we can have nothing but theories about such things. We are limited by the state of our being and the state of being of man, 1, 2 and 3, in such that we cannot know these things for certain. Question: did you say that one could not possibly remember a former life? Answer: yes, only essence can remember, and since in ordinary man essence is unorganized and not separated from personality, we do not remember. At the same time, the fact that one person has one kind of essence and another kind is one of the strongest arguments for pre-existence, because essence cannot be born out of nothing, it is too definite. But the system takes man only from birth to death. Question: where does the part of us which recurs come from? Answer: it is you. When we speak about recurrence, we think about our recurrence. Where this part comes from, we do not know, and we can spend our whole life on theoretical definitions, but it will not change anything or help our psychological understanding of the idea. I am now trying to establish certain principles which will give us a practical understanding of it. We can find many words, but words will not lead anywhere. Have you found the answer why C influences cannot be wasted? Think about that. If you answer that question, you will answer many other questions, and this you do know. Put 2 and 2 together. Question: Is it because if such a thing would be liable to recur again and again, you waste it? Answer. This is implied, but it is not the answer. Certainly, if it is wasted and again wasted, what is the use? But there is something you do not see in all this, and yet it is the key to the whole thing. It is very simple. There is nothing mysterious. It is not a puzzle. It is merely a question of thinking. Try to think like this. Take an ordinary school. A boy goes to school and every year begins to learn the same thing. He studies something for a whole year, then goes home and forgets everything and has to learn the same thing all over again. Again he studies it for a whole year and again goes home and forgets, and again comes back and learns the same thing. What will they say to him at school? This is why schools are not repeated, why there is no recurrence for schools. And this is what people want. They want to learn the same thing again. But next time you must be in a higher school. If you cannot go to a higher school, there will be no other school on this level, because you have already passed it. Question. Would you meet a school through C influence? Answer. School means C influence. You meet the school through B influences. Question. You cannot go into a higher class unless you pass an examination. Answer. Quite right, but you can pass the examination and forget everything. It happens very often. Question. But to a certain extent you have learnt how to learn. Answer. Sometimes and sometimes not. You learn how to learn and you learn how to forget. Question. It seems to me from what you have said that this C influence is transmutation, the power to transmute, and anything less than that is not C influence. Answer. Quite right, you are very near, but you can also take C influence simply as a certain amount of knowledge. Question. Knowledge that can be used? Answer. No, that again is a definition. I said knowledge. Definitions will not help. It is strange that you do not see it, that you do not catch what it means simply. Transmission of knowledge means C influence. It means a certain work. It does not happen by itself. It means somebody's work, and somebody's work cannot be wasted. If it brings results, it can be continued, but if it brings no result, then naturally it will stop. This explains why the possibility of recurrence must be limited. If one comes to a school and does not profit by being in the school, naturally one cannot come again and again to learn the same thing. One must make something of it. Try to understand it, because without understanding these principles it is impossible to speak about recurrence. All ordinary talks based on mathematics or anything else make it too uniform, and recurrence cannot be uniform. You remember we spoke about materiality of knowledge and about the fact that one has very little chance even to begin, because many favourable circumstances are necessary for that. But you must understand that when one begins to get a certain knowledge, chances become smaller and smaller, because if one does not use it, it will be more and more difficult to get, quite naturally. And the same thing applies to every day, every year, to all our life. This is what must be understood. The idea of recurrence is useful because it refers to this life. If we do not do something today, how can we expect to do it tomorrow? If we can do it today, we must. Nobody can put it off till tomorrow, because tomorrow we could do something else. We always think we have time. Question. Does it mean that if we do not listen to what you say today, we will not hear it again? Answer. Or maybe you will be here, but I will not be here. How can you know? Question. Can we only make progress through you? Answer. No. You are quite free to find some other place. You are not bound at all. If you know somebody else with whom you can make progress, certainly you must use him. One must not lose any opportunity if one has an opportunity. Question. I meant, are you the only medium here? Answer. No, nobody can be the only one. If you know another way, there is another opportunity. But if you do not know of another opportunity, if you know nobody but me, then you must try to get it from me. If you know somebody else, you can get it from somebody else. Is it quite clear? Only remember one thing, it cannot be a theoretical study. We must learn in practice how to do the most important things for us. Question. Are opportunities always there, only we are too asleep to notice or use them? Answer. Opportunities may be different, but there are different degrees. If one has not come to the work, one has the opportunity to accumulate knowledge, material, tendencies. They may not be very strong, but they may all lead in the same direction, or they may lead in the opposite directions. Then, in what we call work, which means influence C or direct knowledge, direct study, opportunities are different, and real opportunities begin only from the moment one uses them. Question. In the idea of recurrence, things happen again, but do schools necessarily appear in the same places? Perhaps in my last recurrence this system never came to England. Answer. This is the difficulty about recurrence, because when people hear about it and begin to think, they think in the ordinary formatory, that is, logical way, or very often they think quite illogically or worse. But even if they think logically, they have not enough material, they do not know enough to think about it. It is necessary to understand first of all that we are speaking about a theory, and secondly that this theory must be sufficiently full. There must be sufficient material in it. When we think about recurrence, we think that everything repeats, and this is exactly what spoils our approach to it. The first thing to understand about recurrence is that it is not eternal. It sounds absurd, but actually it is so, because it is so different in different cases. Even if we take it theoretically, if we take purely people in mechanical life, even their lives change. Only certain people, in quite frozen conditions of life, have their lives repeating in exactly the same way, maybe for a long time. In other cases, even in ordinary mechanical life, things change. If people are not so definitely governed by circumstances, like great men who have to be great men again, and nobody can do anything about it, there are variations, but again not forever. Never think that anything is forever. It is a very strange thing, but it seems as though people who have no possibilities, even owing to certain conditions, or to their own insufficient development, or to some pathological state, can have their lives repeating without any particular change, whereas in the case of people of theoretical possibility, their lives can reach certain points at which they either meet with some possibility of development, or they begin to go down. It is either one or the other. They cannot go on remaining forever in the same place, and from the moment they meet with some real possibility, they either recognize the possibility of doing something, or they lose it and then go down. Just think about it, and perhaps you'll be able to formulate some questions. Question. Does the ability to recognize the possibilities depend on change of being, which can only be achieved after a long period of small efforts? Answer. There are two things we must understand about this. Things are in a different relationship to possibilities. Some things, although they have not yet happened, and although it may seem to us that they can happen in one way or in another way, are in reality predestined. Nothing can be changed, because such big causes are moving these things that, although they have not yet happened, they can happen only in one way. In relation to some other things, the repetition is not so strict. There are many gradations, and side by side with things that can happen only in one way. There may be older things, which are still to come, which can happen this way or that way. It is necessary to understand this as a principle, as to understand why things are different and what is different about them. Take today. Certain things have to happen tomorrow because their causes lie in last year or in 10 or 20 years ago. But if the cause of certain things that will happen tomorrow lies in today, then they can happen differently tomorrow if something is done differently today. So it is a question of the nature of the causes and of where they are. You can look at it like this. Suppose you see things going on in exactly the same way for a long time. Then you cannot expect a sudden change without some particular reason. Other things may be comparatively new. A certain tendency has just appeared and so it may easily disappear. But if the tendency has been going on in the same direction for a long time, it is difficult to see a possibility of change. That is the only way we can discuss it, for we cannot know anything definite about these things. You must remember one principle in relation to this. Things are not the same. If you say that some things can be changed and apply it to everything, you will be wrong, because things are never in the same relationship to the possibility of change. Question. May the possibility of variation in people's recurrences mean that people born in one recurrence might not be born in the next? Answer. This is possible only in some cases, but we cannot go into details of this kind. What I want you to understand definitely is that as long as people are quite mechanical, things can repeat and repeat almost indefinitely. But if people become more conscious, or if the possibility of becoming conscious appears, their time becomes limited. They cannot expect an unlimited number of recurrences if they have already begun to know something or to learn something. The more they learn, the shorter becomes their time. People always forget that there is only a very limited number of chances for everybody. So if one loses a possibility in one life, then next life one will lose it more easily. The closer one comes to the possibility of change, the smaller the number of chances becomes. And if one finds a chance and does not use it, one may lose it altogether. It is the same principle as that which applies to one life. You remember, it was said that in the work, in relation to one life, time is counted. And the more seriously people work, the more strictly is their time counted. If you want to work for 2 months and sleep for 10 months, it is counted that you worked for 12 months, even though you actually worked for only 2. But the requirements or conditions are for 12 months, and the more one works, the more those requirements grow. If one works very little, one may remain in the same relation to a certain idea for a year or 2 years. One may misunderstand something and not lose much through it because there is still a 3rd year. But if a man has already begun to work in earnest, he cannot have 3 years, because every day is an examination, and he must pass one examination in order to come to another examination. That must be understood, and the same principle can be applied to recurrence. Question. Is it that if we are completely mechanical, we must recur in exactly the same way, but if we are less mechanical, our recurrences are fewer? Answer. It is not exactly like that. As I said, there are many different categories of people. There are people whose lives repeat automatically in exactly the same way. Other people may have different small changes and modifications, all on the same level. Then a 3rd category, to put it very roughly, may have some possibility in the sense that the changes that happen in their lives are not quite aimless, but are nearer and nearer to some B influence. Then the 4th category comes nearer to the possibility of meeting a school. The thing to understand is that people are not equal in relation to these possibilities, and of course those who have already found some possibility and have discarded it prove themselves incapable of development. Question. I still do not understand why time should be limited for anyone who has worked, but not for one who has not. Answer. For one who has not begun to awake, time is not counted because it does not exist. Everything repeats, always the same thing, again and again. You can take it like this. Knowledge is limited, but since such people do not take any knowledge, for them it is not limited. Then, as I said, you can draw a comparison with an ordinary school. It is not possible always to remain in the same class. One must either make progress or go. Certain demands are made, and if people do not fulfill these demands, they may lose the possibility. So if one has begun to work, one must go on. Suppose someone begins to work and then fails. This shows his inability to work. And then what is the meaning of his existence? Try to think about it from this point of view. Question: is everyone given access to one of the ways in some cycle or other? Answer: I do not know, and we cannot know such things. We can speak only about ourselves. We have a chance. That is all we know. So we must think about ourselves. Question: the future in the work seems like walking on a tightrope. Can one hope to attain another level of stability later? Answer: every state has many different forms, and so has the state of sleep. There may be sleep with possibility of awakening, sleep with less possibility, possibility of awakening, and sleep without any possibility of awakening. Question: to have memory of another recurrence, is it necessary to change something in essence? Answer: no, it is necessary to become conscious in this life. You have only this life. You can say to yourself, if I lived before, I do not remember it. This means that if I live again, I will not remember. If you become conscious in this life, you will remember, and you will remember as much as you remember now. If you do not remember yourself now, then next time again you will not remember yourself, so it will be the same. The possibility of change starts only with the possibility of beginning to remember yourself now. All other things are just words. Question: if personality dies with us, what effect can attempts to weaken it have in future recurrence? Answer: there is no need to be very dogmatic about it. When we speak about recurrence, we speak of something that recurs, and this something keeps in itself traces of all the created tendencies. If the tendency of weakening personality has been created, it will continue. And if the opposite tendency has been created, a tendency to strengthen personality, again it will continue. It is quite right that personality dies, but if this something recurs, then the same causes will produce the same effects. If certain new tendencies have been created, they too will have their effect. So a man who showed a real love of sleep from childhood may fall asleep even earlier. Question: then the only thing we can keep is the change, if any, that we make in essence? Answer: no, first you must make changes in personality. Question: but that will not last. Answer: it is the only thing we can do.